Well, hello there, faithful politics listeners and watchers. If you're joining on YouTube, it's great to have you here. This is Josh Bertram. I'm your faithful host, and we have, as always, my friend and the good man himself, the political host, Will. Good to see you, Will.
Yeah, it's good to be seen.
Yes, it is. It is. And today we have the distinct privilege of interviewing Ryan George, who is the author of several books, Sacred to Life and the book Word on the Street, and his newest book, Hurt and Healed by the Church. We're going to talk to him about that today. He's a blogger behind explorience.org, and he's co-founded and co-leads the Dude Group. I love that name.
Me
A
too.
spiritual adventure community in the Blue Ridge Mountains where he lives with his wife, Crystal, and daughter, Diani. Is it Diani or Dioni?
You got it right on your first try. Way to go, man. Not
Diani.
everybody does.
That's good, man. I think that's an awesome name. So thank you so much for coming on the program with us, Ryan.
Oh, I'm stoked for this conversation.
Yeah, same here, man. So just to kind of start us off, give us a sense of who you are. Who is Ryan George? I kind of read a biography there, but kind of talk to us a little bit about what led you to the place to write this book, and give a little bit of your history so the audience can get to know you a little bit.
Sure. Well, I'll answer the first question first, and that's so I'm a world traveler. I've been to all 7 continents, both polar circles, looking for God in random places. Wow. And I found him in some very random places. And so that's what I wrote my last book about. And in that process, as I was talking to publishing professionals, my publisher, my publicist, different people, they're like, hey, tell us your backstory before we go promote this book. And when I told them that, they went, wait. That's the book we want. I was like, well, this is the book I just wrote. They're like, that's fine. We'll go through the process of this. But the book we want to, publish and market is your backstory. They're like, how does this happen, dude? And it's interesting because what led me to start going around the world looking for affirmation and adventure and novelty and all the things we're looking for in the digital age on Instagram was running from my past. And so what's been interesting over the last 5 years, and I've logged over 200 hours of counseling. I've gone to talk to mentors, gone to conferences and retreats and whatever to find healing. I finally came to a place where I was willing to tell that story too, not just the cool, fun stories. But anyway, the backstory. So I am the son of a predatory pastor, a serial sex offender pastor. He was verbally, physically, and spiritually abusive to me. We can get into that later if you want. But I grew up scared of God the Father because I was scared of my own father. And he was a pastor. He was my pastor. My tithe checks went to his church. We went 4 services a week. I had to serve, set up the chairs, tear everything down, did all the work of the church with my dad. And then I left there to go to an even more conservative college where I went to church 8 times a week, plus Bible classes that were required and evening
smokes.
Bible studies. And they even replaced our spring breaks with 13 church services. They called that spring break on top of our normal stuff. And so I grew up with a very unhealthy view of God. I keep coming back to the word superstitious because I was just trying to keep him happy. And I had all these beliefs that were passed down to me from my dad and from men like my dad that told me that God is a bully. He's wanting to knock you down. Like, you got to detect what little blessings he gives you because that's the exception to the rule. Very controlling, authoritarian environments that I was in. And so I had to go through a process. I left that cult and that faith 22 years ago. And it's taken years before I was able to call it abuse. It's taken years before I saw how rampant it is in our culture, like how widespread that mojo, not just like the movement that I was in, but how those types of pastors and congregations across multiple kinds of faiths proliferate, how cults develop and stuff like that. And so I've been able to get language and healing and then help other people get out, help other people who've gotten out, like process through their emotions and what they're discovering. And then do that on the faith side as well. Say, hey, if you've been wounded by the church, if you've been hurt by people who use Jesus' name against you, here's some other things to think about. And so that's what ended up becoming my book.
That's really cool. Out of all the people that we've spoken to that have experienced some level of church hurt, and we just spoke with a woman recently named Kate West, who wrote a book called Rift that really kind of is sort of similar to your book. She sort of chronicles her own sort of spiritual hurt in her life. And it's like rarely do I hear the healing part. Like I hear a lot of the hurt by the church, but I rarely hear the and healed. So I'm curious, like why was it important to kind of include that portion?
Yeah, I'm not trying to tear down the church. My counselor has a phrase that I really like. She says, if you're wounded in relationship, those wounds can only be healed in relationship. And I've built on that further without her permission. And I think that wounds that happen in a faith community can only finally fully be healed in some sort of faith community. Now, it may not be a church like a Sunday service or how we define church classically in America. But what I have found is that in various faith communities, both church and parachurch organizations that I've been a part of, that the wounds that I absorbed from harmful people and other religious environments have been healed, have been redeemed, have found more than a silver lining. They've found value and worth to me. And I have a passion for people a lot of my friends who grew up in the same environments I have not rebuilt their faith. They've just walked it away, set a torch to it, and left. And Kate and I have overlaps on our story. We both share a publicist. We're familiar with each other's stories. We're friends online. I can relate to a lot of her story. But yeah, I would say my story is the exception to the rule and not the rule from my own personal perspective and the people that I talk to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's I love the question that you asked, Will, because I think it is important that we're thinking about this healing process. And of course, that some people have gone through it. They may not have felt like they can share a healing process at this point, or they're not ready to do so. But there is a lot of hurt, right? Of course, that has been caused by the church. And we don't want to stay with the hurt, although we want to acknowledge that and make that very clear that this has happened and not hide it. And I think, though, that next part is really important to help people understand how to heal and how to distinguish between the church and the people of one, distinguish between the people that have hurt us and the church, which sometimes those, obviously, when it happens in a church context, it's very difficult to untangle those things, and that makes a lot of sense. And the church itself, right, has to take ownership of that, especially when there's been leadership flaws and things missed when it comes to the leaders, the ones that were supposed to be protecting. And then
especially
also
when that abuse was wrapped in Bible verses.
Yes.
So like one of the things my dad used to do was he would assault a young lady. I've heard this from two different people of his victims. And they said he would pray in front of them asking for forgiveness out loud. And then he would turn to them and say, look, I just asked forgiveness for God. And we know, and he would quote the verses that Jesus offers forgiveness. So then you need to forgive me, one. And two, you don't need to tell anybody because now that's gossip. I think that's a level that church hurt, different than school hurt, different than coach hurt. Like abuse happens in all kinds of places in America and abroad. But I think what makes church hurt so much deeper is that it takes the thing that should be the safest part of our lives, our connection to the supernatural, our sense of belonging on this planet, all the things that are wrapped up in healthy spirituality. And then it weaponizes that against you to where you don't even believe your own soul. Like you don't believe your own body, your own hurts. And so I get why people wouldn't come back. I mean, if I got abused and hurt and messed up in a YMCA, I'm probably going to work out anywhere but a YMCA for the rest of my life.
Right. No, absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that healing portion is so important. The acknowledgement of the deep, just the horrific nature of taking, like you said, well said, the source something that's supposed to be the source of joy and peace and healing, and making that actually the source of pain and hurt. And one of the contexts that you speak of in your book, and that a lot of people are probably still involved in and know about, is the independent fundamental Baptist kind of movement. I heard you say cult, which is super interesting. So for those unfamiliar, what distinguishes this IFB from other Baptist denominations or other denominations in the church? Kind of what is kind of help us understand what it is and why even that you would use the word cult to describe it.
Sure thing. Yeah, if you want a shorthand, the Shiny Happy People documentary shows a lot of it. That they were in a subset next to the subset I was in. We used some of the same materials and followed the same voices as them. But the most important part of that IFB is the I, the independent. These churches they're part of a Baptist denomination, but they are not accountable to anybody, going vertically or down. There's no elders in most of these churches. There's no like deacon board in a lot of them. There's nobody who can speak to the pastor. And the way it's sold is this almost like Arthur and the Sword and the Stone, like this man of God, and they call themselves the man of God, the MOG. I am the MOG. You do not mess with me. They pull the sword out, and if you didn't pull a sword out of a stone, you can't talk to that guy. Like, you can't tell him. They will tell you over and over. My dad would do this all the time. He would quote the verse, "Touch not the Lord's anointed." My dad would quote the story where Elisha called the she-bears out of the woods to attack the people who were making fun of him. He's like, don't even make fun of, like, there's one pastor out in, I think, Indiana or Illinois, I was reading about online, and he used to make his underlings that would sit on stage with him, like the assistant pastors, do push-ups during the services randomly. He'd like point over to him like, "What? Get down and give me 13," because it was all about, I am the main man around here. I'm the bleep, right? Like, you're going to do what I tell you to do. And so then what happens is these guys can create whatever boundaries around what you believe because they say, "Thus saith the Lord," and then they add their own spin. Like, we had pastors who would say a woman has to wear a dress to her ankles, not to her knees, because if she shows any legs at all, it makes me think about her crotch. There was one pastor, I did not sit under this guy. I was reading a story online. He preached against open-toed shoes for girls, when they wear sandals in the springtime, because he's like, any skin showing at all, almost like the Muslim faith, any skin showing at all is seductive. We're like, this is a 3-year-old on Easter wearing sandals. Like, what in the world are we doing here? At my college, men and women had to use separate elevators so we wouldn't have sex in the elevators. Like, they just didn't trust. They had all these rules. Certain times a day, we had to walk on separate sidewalks. We couldn't even walk on the same sidewalk together. There was all these rules, when you could swim, when you couldn't, who you could swim with. Like, could you swim with your sister? Yes. But could you swim with your sister's friend? No. Like, there's all these things. And they preach it from the pulpit as, "Thus saith the Lord." And because most of the people in these congregations, one, are uneducated, it's not true of all of them, but a lot of them, they tend to be rural, but they're also a lot of suburban now too, is that they know that nobody knows as much about the Bible as they do, which isn't much to begin with, if you ask me, but they know that they can say these things and people just assume it's. We had a guy get up and quote a verse. It's in the Old Testament. You can read it. And it says, "Do not bow down to the trees with golden bulbs and lay gifts." And he got up in the pulpit and he says, "Thus saith the Lord, we should not have Christmas trees." It says right here. And we're like, did you put that in the like, they didn't have Christmas trees when this thing was written. Like, that's not what this thing is about. But you take an uneducated person who hears that verse, reads those little words and goes, "Well, yeah, I guess we shouldn't have Christmas trees. And I guess maybe we shouldn't even give gifts on Christmas." And that they create a theology around it, and people walk out. And that's what the Sunday service is. Rather than equipping the saints to help as it is on heaven to be as it is on earth, they're creating all these boundaries to make everybody feel holier about themselves. Again, to try to appease this mercurial bully in the sky.
That's so wild. So I've mentioned this on the show before. I mean, I've spent more of my life as an atheist than a believer. And I'm glad I didn't have this podcast when I was an atheist, because I probably, like, based on the conversations I've had with people, like, I would probably never come to the faith, So right. I appreciate just your candor and kind of describing all that. But I want to kind of get back to something you mentioned at the beginning about your father was a predatory pastor, and just like learn a little bit more kind of about your upbringing. Like, at what point in time did you say, "Hey, wait a minute, like, my dad is doing some things that seem really weird or off"? Can you kind of talk us through sort of that evolution of thought and belief that you had?
Sure. Yeah. What was strange is that up until middle school, my dad was not the guy that is mentioned in my book, and not the guy that's detailed on podcasts, and not the guy that's in the news for doing despicable things. There was this transition when I was pulled out of Christian school, IFB Christian school. So I always went to really small schools, but they pulled me out to homeschool me for logistical reasons because I had a bunch of sisters and brothers, and we were having to get up at like 6 a.m. to drive me to another state to go to an IFB school. And I thrived in that environment. I was bullied, but I thrived academically. And I did not want to give that up. That was the only thing in my life that was a guaranteed affirmation. I knew I could get A's. I knew I could perform. I didn't play sports. I didn't have musical talent. That was it. And so when my parents chose to homeschool me, I really pushed back. At that same time, it was right about the time I got taller than my dad. At that same time, it's right when I got faster than my dad, right? I'm 13 years old, 14. I remember when my dad turned 40, he took us out to the driveway and he said, I can still outrun you. I don't care how tall you are. And I smoked his ass. I mean, I beat him by so far, like I was on the cool down by the time he comes across the line. And from that moment on, my dad's interactions went from verbally hard to verbally harsh. And then physical things started to happen. One time he hung me, he choked me by holding me off the ground while my feet dangled until I surrendered to him. One time it was minus 32 degrees outside Fahrenheit, and he sent me outside for freeze therapy or freeze discipline. He would throw me through things. He threatened to knock all my teeth out. He said, "You'd be picking your teeth off the floor the next time." He was just super dangerous. And then he would weaponize the Bible verse. So he'd go back to the Old Testament where it says, if you disrespect your parents, you deserve to be stoned to death publicly. And he's like, you're lucky I'm letting you stay alive. Now get in line. And so that happened anytime we got in a verbal spar where he didn't have a reason other than, well, because, or whatever. Like he could have winsomely said, how much do you love your siblings? Do you love them enough to not go to school so that we can be home? They could have gone that route, but instead they're like, you're not in line. You're not conforming. And then it leads to the opening scene in the book where I'm getting ready to leave for college and he's on top of me, red face, inches off my face, saying, you're going to hell. And every Sunday, I pray that you walk the aisle. This, though, he'd been there when I gave my life to Christ. He was there when I got baptized. He was there, all those things. But because I wasn't falling in line and doing things his way, it was, you're a problem. You don't belong here. And then we didn't know about the sexual stuff until years later. We don't know how many victims my dad has. It may span several states based on some things we're learning now. We still don't know. He's not confessed to anything that happened before we moved to Maryland when he started a new church in Maryland. But he and my mom were teachers in a small IFB school up in Pennsylvania. They were 2 of the 4 teachers in this whole school. That's how small the school was. And in the middle of a school day in November, we just up and moved to Maryland for him to start a new church. And the church paid us for like a year and a half going away money, like make the problem going away money. So we don't know if stuff happened in Pennsylvania, but we started to hear stories as after I was married, coming out in meetings and podcasts, different things. And we started putting them together that my dad has a series of events. And the one now that would be like patient 0 or victim 0 that we know about. When she went to my mom, there's 2 witnesses that heard my mom say, "Oh, not again." So we don't know how far it goes back. I had a really weird encounter in college in the late 90s. So in the IFB faith, they're really big on the door-to-door visitation, kind of like the Mormons and Jehovah's Witness. And so we were going door to door, me and my mom, and we walk up to this stranger's house. She opens the door, and through the screen, we're like, "Hey, do you have a faith? Do you have a church? We'd love to invite you to ours." And she said, "Oh, well, where do you guys go?" And we told her, she said, "Oh, I would never go there. The pastor there is having an affair." And my mom is 6 inches to my left, and I'm like, "Whoa, this is awkward." And my mom looks to the lady, she says, "Oh, you don't know my husband," or "That's my husband. That couldn't be." And this stranger through the screen door said, "Well, ma'am, you don't know your husband." And so the first teenager that he assaulted, my dad actually did tell me he'd had an affair, quote unquote, but that's all he told me. And there's been sleight of hand. Starting in 2012, I started recording conversations with my dad, and we've got conflicting confessions from him, but we still only have partial story, partial idea of just how prolific my dad was how many victims he had. We don't know.
How did how did this all play out? Like legally, was there some kind of, did anything happen? And how did the church handle these kinds of accusations? What went on? I mean, that's pretty serious. And then, Kind of walk me through that. And then, I mean, I'm assuming it wasn't great, kind of from your response at this point.
Yeah, I don't know. Like there were so many euphemisms. Like I remember the excuses that my parents gave me for why we moved, or why we changed schools or whatever. But I don't know that I've ever heard the real story. As far as the legal side of it, one of my dad's victims said, I'm not comfortable pressing charges. Like, I don't want to be in the news. I don't want to do all that. I actually talked to law enforcement in her county. One of the detectives called me earlier this year, actually. And I said, yeah, I'll cooperate. I'll give you whatever. Ask any question. Like, I'll help you. I don't have any problem with my dad serving time. He deserves that and more. The other victim, her time ran out for statute of limitations. And she said, hey, will you talk to my attorney? I think at that time we had like 14 months left before statute of limitations ran out in her state. And I said, yeah. So I talked to her attorney, answered all the questions. And he's like, man, your dad was so slick. It's like he knew this day was coming. Like, his tracks were so well covered. And at a certain extent, for sexual assault, particularly if there's no like medical records, right? Like if no one went to the hospital, which neither of his victims had, because they weren't rape situations, they were other types of assault that were inappropriate. There's no record, and it's a he said, she said, right? And so as far as how it went down in the church where my dad pastored when the one victim came forward, the mother of the victim says, you get out of Dodge, shut this thing down, or we go public with your story. And he just chose to slip out. Like, okay, well, this Sunday's my last Sunday in the pulpit, and he left. And nothing legally ever came of it. One of my dad's victims went to a Christian college down in Tennessee, and her sister and her reported it to the administration, and they did nothing. They referred it to some pastors in my dad's state. They did nothing. And so a lot of victims in the United States don't have full confidence that even when they report that they'll be believed. I'm meeting this Saturday with one of my dad's victim's sisters. I have not seen her in 25 years. She was in a youth group with one of my kid sisters. And I told her, I said, I'm meeting you just to tell you that I believe your story. Because up till now, nobody has. Like,
oh my goodness.
I'm driving 3 hours each way just to go up there and meet her and be like, hey, tell me your story. And know that I'm going to hold it with kindness and that I believe you. Because so many victims never get that privilege. They never get a chance for their story to be believed. And statistically, like, what is it, 97 or 9? I don't remember. Don't quote me on this. Like, the vast, vast, vast majority of people who claim to have been sexually assaulted, it's true. Like, they aren't making this up. And so my posture has been to believe the people who've come forward on my dad. It's not a big mental jump for me to go, oh, he could go from saying and physically doing the things to me to doing things to girls, and teenagers. So my wife overheard him grooming a 9 and 11-year-old. We were at a function. Kids are in and out of my parents' house all the time, which is part of the scary part of this, because they're Pastor and Mrs. George, right? Like, they got a pool and they got a big kitchen, a big gathering space. And my wife was in the next room over working on a painting, and she heard my dad talking to a 9 and 11-year-old about how the women of Song of Solomon would praise for their body parts. And she was like, wait, what? And pulls her earbuds out. And the girl's parents didn't believe, because they didn't know all the stuff that we knew at that time about my dad. So it was just an anomaly. Like, well, that's just weird. Maybe you misheard it, And so these predators, they know, like, if you move around enough, if you switch churches, if you do enough good acts, if you love bomb people, you change out their water heater, you fix your car, you do all those kinds of things, then people aren't going to believe when victims come forward. And my dad's really good at that. He's a handyman, and he attracted, I can't tell you how many of the people in my dad's church were single moms, were, middle-aged women who didn't have a husband to fix their car or whatever. And so he does all these things. He comes over and helps you fix your fence when your dog gets out or whatever it is. Well, then when someone has a story, you're less likely to believe it, right? And so it's multifaceted. And he's gotten away with all of it. So from a legal perspective, now what I put my hope in is Jesus said, it's worse for the person who harms a child, causes a child to stumble, than it is for someone thrown into a sea with a millstone around their neck. And so my dad knows he's not outrunning justice with a capital J, and I know that, and that's what helps me sleep at night.
Yeah, how hard was it to go public? So right now Trump's on trial, right, for all the stuff he's been doing, and as a result of that, that there were key witnesses that had to come forward to basically sort of speak their truth and talk about what happened. So like, what was the process for you to, reconcile with the way you're feeling and actually go public with it? Because I mean, I think by any objective measure, like if I were part of the prosecution, like you would be a key witness because like
Right.
you're the son of the person. So talk to us about that.
So in terms of Trump's current trial right now, I'm more Michael Cohen than Hope Hicks.
I got you.
My family definitely sees me as the Michael Cohen, right? My family, my mom doesn't want to be around me. My sisters, the last time I was around my sisters, they asked me to leave because mom might show up, and they want to. My mom still lives in the same house as my dad, runs a business with him, and so there's a sense that they want to protect this family image, whereas I don't care. It was awkward for me because my name is Ryan Timothy George, and my dad's name is Timothy George, so like. It's my own name that's out there. And maybe that's why I have such more of a sense for wanting justice, is because I want to clear my own name, if you will. Like I want to make sure in the SEO that my name still comes up as adventure guy and not as serial predator guy. But as far as being willing to come forward and write a book, one, it was my publicist and my publisher and other people coming to me like, your story is compelling. Like we don't hear of people, not only who are you still in the church, but you lead ministries. Like you and your wife are a thriving couple in the faith. You're discipling people. Like people are meeting Jesus and being discipled through you. How does that happen? We want a book about that. So that was encouraging. One. Two was, I went to my pastor right when I decided to write the book. And I said, how do I write this book? Like I want to tell the truth, but I don't want, this isn't just to get a pound of flesh. This isn't vengeance, because I could do that. And he said, well, use the filter of how can I honor my parents? The Bible says that you may leave home, but you never outgrow the command to honor your parents. So find a way to honor your parents. And so I paid for, 3-4 rounds of editing on the book. I paid freelancers and different people. And I said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to edit out all the angst. I want people to not feel vengeance in my words. Can you do that? And to a person, all of them did, to where when I finally got done and I gave the book to the victims, I let them read it before I went to press. Like, hey, I want you to know, I changed their names and stuff, but I wanted them to feel honored. I changed some details about their story so that people wouldn't be able to like look them up on the internet and stuff like that. And so then I had to make that choice. Like, I went to my wife and said, listen, I have a publicist to pay. I have all these different marketing expenses, those really cool boxes that you guys got in the mail that came out of my own money, right? To go, how I'm investing a lot of money into this, a lot of time for sure. How can I do this in a way that represents Jesus? So in the mornings, this morning, I went and I prayed. I went on a prayer walk in the park. I have guys praying for me at church. I have guys praying for me in a parachurch organization I'm in, to say, I want to tell this story in a way that makes Jesus look amazing. And if it comes at the expense of my dad, oh well. And if it's going to be uncomfortable for me, that's a price I'm willing to pay.
I mean, that I just want to honor you for that. And even trying to live by biblical principles to continue to honor your parents and to continue to honor all the people that have suffered in this and are implicated in this. That's got to be a very tough thing to do. Very tough. And I just, it's heavy. And I just want to thank you for your work that you're doing for the kingdom, because we need voices that are honest about the abuse and about the negative aspects of the evangelical church, right? Whether it's specific aspects of it or as a whole, people from the inside that are continuing to be there to reform and to bring it back to the teachings of Jesus. We need that so desperately, because what people mostly hear, to Will's point before, is this is how the church has failed me, and this is why I left it. And those are important stories to hear. Don't get me wrong.
Right.
But I have my own stories in my life of things that I have gone through in the church and things that have been said and all of that. And I've remained faithful to the best of my ability to Jesus, because when I go to the Gospels, when I go to the actual words of Jesus, which is one of the points you make in your book, when you get back to the actual words of Jesus, it's very different sometimes than the Jesus we see represented. Either by, on the one side, the claims that are trying to discredit Jesus or the historical reliability of the Gospels, any one of those things, that there's a certain picture of Jesus that's presented. And then on the other side of people that would say they believe in inerrancy and infallibility and all these things, they can present this Jesus who no one wants to be around because it's a Jesus that doesn't really love people. But
Well,
it's
and
a
I understand
Jesus
too how they wrap their Jesus around Trump. Like,
yeah,
I remember in the 90s, so I used to listen to Rush Limbaugh 3 hours a day when I was homeschooled. And I'm well familiar with all the things that were brought against President Clinton. And I'm not a big fan of him either. But, and how Christians were so holier than thou about it. Like, everything was about, and then now the things that they're excusing for Trump are, it pales in comparison what Clinton did to that. And I don't think that we should justify either. But what I'm saying is I can understand because I've seen how people justify my dad and wrap their fate. Like, I remember after some of the first allegations came out about my dad, and I wanted to put some boundaries around my dad because I have a teenage daughter at the time, and my wife. And I was like, man, I just don't want this creep around my women, And my sisters were like, well, are you really living in forgiveness? Like, how do you define forgiveness? Right? And it's the same thing we're seeing verses used about different politicians. Matt Gaetz. The college I went to was Matt Gaetz's home district, right? So I'm a 2 for 2 there. And the guy that represents me now, Bob Good, is not good. So I watched people take my faith and wrap it around despicable people and say, no, we should vote for this person because of Jesus. It's the same as those who justify abusers and horrific things being done in the name of the church. And I've had to really work through that Ephesians 6 passage where it says, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against spiritual forces and darkness in high places, and go, oh, Jesus, or the bad side of the force, or whatever you want to call it, Satan, the devil, whatever, it can use the church as much as it can use anything in secular culture, if not more, to turn people away from God. And I'm seeing it over and over and over again.
That's really amazing. You had mentioned a couple times, you had mentioned it specifically, but then kind of this reference to shiny, happy people and the kind of connection there with Bill Gothard. And if anyone hasn't seen that documentary, recommend it. Obviously, documentaries, they have agendas, and you have to recognize those agendas. But they're bringing out a story that's important to be heard. What was your personal experience with these teachers, and what is that connection there with the IFB and with
Gothard?
Everything that we're seeing in Gothard and shiny happy people.
Yeah, I will say real quick on the shiny happy people. If you are worried about the agenda in that, I've read the memoirs of both the oldest Duggar daughters, and they don't have that agenda, and they're documenting the same thing. So if you're like, oh, this is a gotcha piece on the Netflix special, read or listen to the audiobooks, because what you'll find out is no, these are corroborating witnesses that are telling it from a much kinder perspective, and they're saying the same things. The connection to what I grew up in is that Bill Gothard was there were several dominant voices in our movement that gave everybody else the talking points, the materials, the whole strategy of how you come at certain things. So like Bill Gothard had this theology thing that in his materials that said that if you're a sexual abuse survivor, you should see it as a gift from God because it's a chance to show his forgiveness to the man of God. In other words, let a man do the things that he does to you because it shows off God's grace when you forgive him. Just disgusting. My sister's church, one of her former pastors, used to have girls perform sexual services on him in his office and then go out and preach in the pulpit against women wearing pants. Like, mind-blowing stuff. So Gothard's materials were pervasive. I went to one of his training courses. The other big voice in that movement is a guy called Jack Hiles, who's now passed. Jack had a mega. It's the biggest IFB church in the history of America. He had 86 buses in his bus route. There's claims that he had 30,000 people at his church on a Sunday. And there's just some really damning videos. His son is a sexual predator, just gross. He got up in the pulpit and said, hey, if a guy gets jailed for rape, the victim should be in the cell right next to him because it's half her fault. Just gross
Dude, that is
stuff.
insane.
Yeah, and it's on YouTube. Like, you can go watch it. I put the link in the footnotes in my book. It's disgusting, and it's unashamed. I mean, there was recently, 3 months ago, it was real big on Instagram. You guys probably saw that pastor just south of me here in North Carolina that said that if a woman accused a guy of rape and they get to the trial and he finds out that the girl was wearing shorts, that he'd let the guy go free. Like, that's an IFB mentality, and that trickles down from Hiles and Bill Gothard. And there was also a publication called The Sword of the Lord, and that had other like second-tier pastors that were blessed by Gothard and Hiles in some ways, like they were sycophants. You know, it's like the second-layer Trump people right now, like the people who are indicted in Georgia. It's like that group. And my dad would get this paper, I think it was like once a month or every 6 weeks or something like that. And it would have your talking points, like these sermons transcribed. And then you could go and take that and put that in your own words and share that with your people. So it was celebrity culture, but it was gross.
Oh my gosh. I mean, so I have like such a deep tension, and here's why. Everything that you're saying is like, it's horrific, right? So I just need to make it very, very, very clear. In no way am I defending anything that anybody has done along those lines. That is absolutely horrific. It should be, whatever legal ramifications and whatever legal pursuits need to happen, that justice needs to be served, right? That's my take. The tension I have is I remember going and I remember looking up stuff when I was a youth pastor years ago and coming across Gothard's material and being like, oh man, this is great stuff. Not that what you said, right. I never saw that.
Right. Well, that's the thing, right?
I wouldn't have thought that was great, but I saw like, it's like about discipline, right? Mm-hmm. And about like young men showing up on time and, having virtue and all these things. And I'm like, oh man, this, and at that old time, like at that time in my life, I'm like, man, I could use some of the stuff. It's kind of like, even with like Mark Driscoll, I remember I listening to Mark Driscoll was really helpful for me at a time when I felt like I needed someone to say, hey, get up, get out of bed, stop being this, don't do that. You know what I mean? Like, I kind of felt like I needed to be kicked in the tail a little bit. And yet then to see the side of it, this authoritarian abuse, it tears me up. And I'm thinking, how do I maintain the things that were good? Things like discipline, which is good, self-discipline. How do I maintain all that? And yet, how do I not throw everything out because of the gross abuse that's happened? Which that's the temptation, right? You throw everything out that has anything to do with this. And you could even see something that has no connection to it at all, but because there's a connection with a teaching of discipline or a teaching of something like that, it would automatically bring up in yourself and your emotions this sense like, I got to push that away. How do you deal with that? How do you recommend working through those kinds of tensions?
So I've ascribed less and less to heroes of the faith, right? Like I put fewer and fewer people on pedestals. Instead of going, well, Mark Driscoll says, which I was never a big fan of his, but I know a lot of my friends were, right? And they go, and
Sure.
Guys I looked up to in the faith were like, oh, you got to listen to this sermon, whatever else. I've been disappointed so many times. Bill Hybels, I used to look up to that guy, right? There's different people I go, how about I go back to what is true? Because a broken clock is right twice a day. One of the podcasts I spoke to, and I forget which one now, says one of the problems is that evil people aren't evil all the time. So I have to go back to the person who is
that's
evil.
Good. Yeah.
I have to go back to the person who is evil never, and that's Jesus. I have to go back to, how did this guy treat women? How did this guy treat people who weren't Hebrews, like the people outside of his socioeconomic? How did he treat outcasts? How did he treat beggars? How did he treat the poor, right? And go, okay, now let me come back and use that measuring stick against every other voice in my life. So right now, one of the guys that I'm still follow on a regular basis is a guy named Brant Hansen, and he's got a book called The Men We Need. And his is not the Mark Driscoll message. It was like, hey, The men we need in our culture are the men who make women safe, the men who tend the garden. When Jesus made Adam in his own image, he said, what I want you to do is take care of this plot of land and the people in it, like, and the animals, whatever else. He's like, how are we let's just use that filter. So does that mean I have to get up at 5 a.m. and do 15 burpees before I go to the bathroom? No, right? It could. It could be different for everybody else. And so what I've learned is to follow voices of grace, voices out of humility, people who don't put themselves on stage. So just, again, to toot Brent's horn a little bit, but several weeks ago, I went to his first conference out in Indiana, and he said, all over the place, we have Christian leadership conferences, but Jesus didn't call us to lead. It's like 300 sometimes he called us to follow. So let's do a followership conference. So we did a session on how to forgive our enemies, a session on how to be a non-anxious presence in the world, a session on what to do with our finances that honors the kingdom, right? Things that we're not being taught at a quote. I used to go to all these leadership, the Catalyst, the Global Leadership Summit, all these different things. And you go, what if instead of trying to work towards stage and towards influence, we work towards humility, towards living a quiet life, to picking up the Samaritans being Samaritans, picking up guys on the side of the road who've been beat up by robbers. How about we do that and get the light back on Jesus? And so I've surrounded myself with guys, and then I read books by guys who I've seen do that with humility. One of my few remaining heroes of the faith does all these crazy missions around the world to help people and doesn't tell anybody, never posts about it online. He goes, hey, I'm about to go do a drop. I rented a C-130 over in Africa. We've got all these foods on pallets with parachutes, and we're going to just drop them over this country. And we don't know which side of the line it's going to land on. Is it going to be these guys or these guys? But what I know is there's hungry kids on both sides of the line, and I'm willing to take that risk. We're just going to airdrop food. And he didn't tell anybody. And so I'm looking for people who don't claim to be men of God, don't claim to be influential, don't claim to have something special, don't have that authoritarian tone. And then I going back to the first part, I measure them against the example of Jesus. And instead of measuring Jesus against the example of the voices in my life, I measure the voices in my life against the example of Jesus.
You know, this is a real quick comment. I know Will has a question, but I wear these Superman shirts. I had one that was so threadbare, and my wife made me throw it away, so I did. There's like holes and like, the
good on her,
in the armpits and stuff. Yes, I know. But the reason I wear it is not because I feel like I'm Superman. I do not at all. But to remind myself that there is no other Superman except Jesus. I mean, honestly, and I know that sounds kind of weird, but like I have been disappointed in the same way. And when we try to treat people like they're Superman, that's a really great way to be very disappointed.
And it's not healthy for them.
And they will. Yes, absolutely.
Like one of the only times my dad was honest with me and candid about his struggles is he told me one time, he said, I never confessed any of my sins to anybody in my church because I thought that if I did, then they couldn't trust me to say, thus saith the Lord on Sundays. And I was like, and my dad was not a celebrity by any means. His church had 35 people. It's not that. But if that's true for my dad, imagine what that is for a Mark Driscoll with, what did he have, 8 campuses or 12 campuses going at one point? What is that for Bill Hybels, who has hundreds of thousands of people following? What is it for these Christian celebrities who have 5, 8, 10 million people following them on Instagram? It's got to become harder and harder to confess. My aunt is a psychologist, and she said one of the reasons we see Britney Spears, Justin Bieber, Michael Jackson, all these people do all these crazy things is they're looking for someone to tell them no. Because all of us need boundaries to figure out our world. And so they keep doing crazier and crazier things, peeing in a janitor's bucket, shaving their head, all the different, hanging their baby off a balcony to hopefully get someone to say no. And because they're so rich and powerful, nobody does. And so what they're craving for is boundaries, but because they've insulated, and I think that's happening with celebrity Christians, celebrity pastors, authors, etc.
Wow. Josh, I actually thought that the reason you wore that shirt is because, my disdain for DC, being
you're a Marvel guy,
a rabid Marvel follower. Marvel has their own sort of Superman, Sentry or Nova, if you read the comic books. But anyways, that's another episode. But, I'm curious, Ryan, like Josh and I have had conversations before about, gatekeeping kind of in the Christian community, sort of like who, gets to wear the label Christian or who doesn't. And a lot of it is like the people that sort of like big church, big C church, identify as Christians are, male, white, Republican, whatnot.
Generally.
But like there are also all kinds of other Christians that would have had an open seat at the table next to Jesus to eat. And I've never really understood why somebody that has been unobjectively ostracized from sort of the American Christian church would actually choose to be or stay a Christian, and especially those that have experienced spiritual abuse. So like I'd love to have you explain kind of like what was your reconstruction of your faith, that has allowed for you and your wife to just, still be in the faith, have a thriving ministry, and still believe the things that the Bible says, when your entire sort of world, that was sort of designed and built, by virtue of biblical scripture, kind of got turned on its head.
So the first part, I just want to call out that you started the process with what you said is my wife. So my wife didn't grow up in what I did. I married outside of the religion that I grew up in. We met at college because her parents were missionaries and needed a place to drop her off for 4 years because they were in the mountains of Bolivia. And so she chafed under that. Imagine not growing up in that environment, and now you have to live 24/7 in that environment. So when we got out and got married, we had to talk about it. And eventually, 2 years into our marriage, I said, I tell you what, let's just do this. I'm going to give you the final call. You get to pick the church. Like, I'll go with you, but you get the deciding vote. And so she picked a Spanish-speaking church in our town that had 14 different nationalities represented. We had a lot of foreign nationals in our church. And what I first started to see that made it a crack in what I believed was that so much of the expression of church is based on culture. Because I could see Venezuelans, and I could see Colombians, and I could see Mexicans, and we even had people from Southeast Asia who they connected with our church because they felt like foreigners here, right? Like they're like, oh, no, I connect with you guys because you're all pilgrims just like us. And so that went, oh, wait, so then what is this subculture that my faith brought to it? And it's that white, male, sexually dominant, all those kinds of things, superstitious. After 2 or 3 years of that church, my Spanish is horrible. I said, babe, I need to go to an English-speaking church. And so I went to a church near our house. And it just so happened to be that it was a church for skeptics. Like they openly, weekly have these meetings where skeptics can come and talk about it. They would bring in people who had been very skeptical, atheists, or had deconstructed a faith. Like they grew up in a religion but had to deconstruct it. And were very open about it. The other thing that was true of them was that our pastors were all these extreme adrenaline guys. We had guys who summited snow-capped mountains, ice climbers, whitewater paddlers, guys who raced motorcycles. One guy flew experimental aircraft. And so they approached faith as an adrenaline rush, as like an adventure. And that really appealed to me. Like we would go, rather than have these discussions in a church, we would go backpack Patagonia for a week and have these conversations looking at glaciers, And so coming at faith as an adventure, and what happens in an adventure, so I like bungee jumping and, jumping off of buildings and stuff like that, is that you don't do it because you're not scared. You actually do it because you're scared. You can't have faith unless you have a little doubt or a little fear or both. You can't get adrenaline and dopamine unless you're a little scared or a lot scared in my case, like when I go out on the wings of airplanes or something like that. And so it became formative for me to go, when something is hard, the reward is greater, whether that's physical, relational, or spiritual. So when it's harder to say, I'm sorry, it's the reward for saying I'm sorry or I was wrong. Yesterday at church, I walked up to a guy at church. I said, I just got to tell you this. On Thursday, I lied to you. And this is what I said to you, and I lied. 20 years ago, 25, when I was in my dad's church, I don't know that would have ever happened. But I knew that I would be closer to this guy after I confessed that I lied to him. So then when you apply that to your faith and go, yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to Scripture and figure out what I really believe. And I'm going to do it with people who are safe to do it with, right? And people who challenge me to do the hard things. One of the guys who's very, very influential in my faith was an undefeated MMA fighter. Not me. I'm soft. I can't fight for anything. But he would, like, his discipline, his training, his physicality and everything. He was like, we can do hard things. You can do hard things physically. You can do hard things spiritually and relationally. And so when you put all those together, what you end up with is this faith where you embrace the uncomfortable moments to the point that So as I became a discussion leader and then a table leader and then an environment leader, then I started my own ministry on the side. One of the values that we had was give everybody else in your circle the gift of going second. As vulnerable as you want that conversation to go, as authentic you want it to be, as hard as you want people to go, as deep as you want people to confess, you got to go first. So every Wednesday night we're sitting around the fire now, I've got to be the one that confesses first. I've got to be the one that says, I'm feeling insecure about this, or this is where my anxiety is off the charts this week, and I could really bring that under the sovereignty of Jesus. Could you pray that over me? And so what I found is that as leaders were vulnerable, but also bold to lean into their discomfort, it was contagious. Kind of like what you were talking about with Mark Driscoll, Josh, was like, you got this, like, you got it through osmosis or through some sort of contagion from him. Like, he looked like he just beat somebody up this morning. I'm going to get out of bed and go run this 5 miler or whatever. It was the same way, but with a different message for me of going, you can do hard things for Jesus. I'm not telling you what it is, but you know what it is. Lean into whatever that whisper is in the back of your head. Go do that, and then report back to me next Wednesday night around the fire.
Dude, that is awesome. And what you've just described is like, it's the dynamics I want to have in my church. And, you know, when we meet as guys, we'll meet together. Some of the ladies will meet together for Bible studies. I want to push into those things like, hey, where is Jesus leading us to confess? Where's Jesus leading us to grow? And how do we grow in those areas together? Because none of this, I didn't get into ministry to preach, although I do love preaching. I think it's one of the gifts that God gave me, and I want to do it, and I want to share it, and I want to communicate. I want to teach the Bible. I love the Bible, and I love teaching it and help people understand it. But it's so important that all that means very little if it doesn't transform someone's life, if it doesn't make a difference today, not tomorrow, right? Today. And that's my prayer. And I love that approach. You know, we have like so many questions we haven't asked yet, and I could keep asking.
Sure,
maybe we'll have a follow-up podcast or something like that to talk about it. But I did want to hone in on something in terms of the recovery and healing, because there are going to be people that listen to this podcast, and this is a different one than ones we've had before. This hits, I think, in a different way. It's pretty personal. And so to the person who's listening to this and they're deconstructing their faith, they've left their faith, but they still have, or they've remained in and haven't really looked at anything, or they're in this process. What do you want to say to them, right? It doesn't matter where they're at. They might have left. They might say, I'm never coming back to a church. That's fine. I mean, I'd hope they'd be able to find a faith community. But what I'm saying is, like, you know, I understand why people are there. What do you want to say to them in terms of the healing and recovery process that you've gone through yourself? What do you want them to know? What do you want them to hear from you? Because I believe that as they say it, this might be a pivotal moment for someone who hears it and is able to take some steps because they listen to a podcast that helped them actually realize there's been abuse, or gave them concepts and a language and even permission. What would you want to say?
So 4 really quick things in succession. First is I would tell them that it is possible. Like, part of the reason people don't read construction is just because they don't even believe that's possible. 2, that you don't have to be in a hurry. You know, I'm 25 years out and I'm still figuring stuff out, right? Like, you can't know. 3, I would recommend they get a counselor if they don't already. It doesn't even have to be a faith-based counselor. Mine is a believer, but that's just part of the filter. One of the other things I would tell them is that the disciples, we get to see disciples deconstructing and reconstructing throughout the Gospels. If you read it through that filter and go, oh, no, these were Jewish kids, some of them really good Jewish kids, some of them not so much, but they were all like Peter was still figuring out 20 years after Jesus resurrected. He got this vision up on the roof going, hey, dude, no, you're allowed to eat ham now. Like, you're good. Try some bacon. It'll change your life. So just that if you want to see people struggle with it in real time, even with Jesus 4 feet away, read the Gospels. It happens. And the other is I would encourage them to look for churches where I don't know how to say this. There's certain things that you can look at a church and find out if it's going to be a welcoming place or if they're just going to whitewash your story. They're going to try to put a bow on it. And I don't know. It's a vibe. That's the best way I can describe it. Like, I get that a church building wouldn't feel safe, but maybe there's a book club in your neighborhood. Maybe there's an online community. Maybe there's some authors that you really like. Maybe there's some podcasters. Find safe voices where you feel like people would believe you and start there. One of the things I tell people is, like, if you fall in love with Jesus again, and that's your focus, not getting back to church. If your focus is, I want to meet the real Jesus, you can claim that promise. Jesus said, if you want to find me, you can find me. All you have to do is seek. In Proverbs, I can't remember which writer in that chapter wrote, but he said, God loves hiding things and kings love finding things. It's almost like there's this eternal scavenger hunt that Jesus will show us as much of himself as we want to find, but he wants us to come looking. And it may not happen in a church building. It may not happen in a church small group. It may not happen in the places where we've been told where Jesus is. But I can tell you, having gone to Antarctica and some of the most remote places in the world, Jesus is everywhere and he wants to be found. And when we pray expectantly, God, I want to find you, we will find him.
That's so good.
And we might get there and find out there was somebody else searching for him and turn around and go, oh, you're after the same guy. Well, let's do this together. And eventually maybe there's 2, there's 3, there's 4. Maybe like me now, I've got 30 guys in the group text for this community we have on Wednesday nights where we're just trying to figure out who Jesus is. We've had people come in and say, hey, I don't believe any of this stuff, but I want someone to pray for me. Right. And you go, all right, we'll show up.
That's so good. I love that. How can people stay connected with you, Ryan? And where can they get your book?
Sure. So the best place to stay connected with me is on Instagram. I'm at Ryplane. That's RYPLANE. And then everything else is at booksbyryan.com.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being on the program with us. It's a compelling story. We really appreciate you coming and sharing your heart.
Oh, man. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, to our listeners and viewers, thank you so much for joining us. And until we see you again, it's not right or left. Keep your conversations up. God bless you guys. Have a great week.